Okay, this is chapter 31. I'm going to go through the review quiz, then go through my notes, and then I'll do a quiz live, as usual. This chapter talks about the budget deficit. So, do we get a useful and meaningful statistic by dividing the national debt by the GDP? So, dividing national debt by GDP would give us the debt to GDP ratio, which is actually a pretty useful thing. It measures the size of debt in relation with the size of the economy. So what that means is if your debt is really big but your economy is really big, as is the case of the US, it might not be too bad. But if your debt is really big and your economy is very small, as in the case of like Greece right now, you're in big trouble. So it is a very meaningful statistic, and it helps show us how grave the debt is in relation to our economy and our GDP. Suppose during one fiscal year, government purchases are 195 billion, debt service payments are 22 billion, and net tax revenues are 208 billion. What is the annual budget deficit / surplus? So, let's go up here for a second. So, talking about the budget constraint. So all government expenditure, everything that they spend money on, the way that they get money is either through tax revenue or from borrowing, issuing bonds. So we can write that as a little formula. We can say government expenditure is equal to the tax revenue plus borrowing. And now they can spend money on two things. They can spend money on goods and services and on interest payments. So here, our government purchases, that's our goods and services, and debt service payments is also written as interest payments. And then our tax revenues are 208 billion. So our budget deficit, or our budget constraint, then we can rewrite, instead of just government expenditure, we can write G plus I times D, which is how we write the interest payments or the debt service payments. And that's equal to T plus borrowing. So if we then rewrite that a bit more, we can see our budget deficit, or the change in debt, is equal to G plus I times D minus T, just rearranging this equation again. So what's important to note here, and what's a little bit confusing, is if you get a positive number in this case, if you get a positive number, that means that you're spending, this part here is your spending, right? That part, if you have a positive number, it means your spending was more than your taxes, more than your revenue. So that increases your deficit. It means you're more in debt, and that's not really a good thing, usually. But if you get a negative number here, if you get a negative, then you have what's called a budget surplus. And that is a good thing because it means your deficit is going down, right? The change in debt is negative, so your debt is going down. So to go through this question here, it would be our expenditures, so 195 plus 22, and then minus our taxes of 208. So 195 plus 22 minus 208 gives us 9 positive. So that means it's not a surplus, it's still a deficit. It's still going up by 9 billion because our spending was more than our revenue. So budget deficit of 9 billion. The year below shows government purchases, blah, blah, blah. Assume the stock of debt is 500 billion. What is the primary budget deficit in 2016? So just looking at the second year here. So we have what the budget deficit is, right? It includes these debt service payments. But what we want to look at as well is something called the primary budget deficit, because the interest payments, that's from borrowing, and most likely you're paying off the borrowing of previous governments. If you're a new government, you're probably still in debt, but it's not exactly your fault. So we have this thing called the primary budget deficit, which is just G minus T. We get rid of the ID, and that's to see how well you're doing as a government. So the primary budget deficit is just G minus T. So in 2016, it's 250 minus 216. That's actually a surplus. Our tax revenues were greater than our government expenditures. So we had a surplus of 12 billion, or a budget deficit, primary budget deficit of negative 12 billion. Okay, the budget deficit function. let's talk about the budget deficit function. So this is what it looks like here. I'll scroll up a little. There we go. So it's a linear function, and it's written as g plus id minus t, and it's mapped against real GDP, and then anything above 0 is a deficit, and anything below is a surplus. That's kind of what we already talked about. If it's negative, then you have a surplus. If it's positive, you have a deficit. So anything above this x-axis here in the red shaded area is a deficit, and anything below is a surplus. Let's talk about some things that can shift this curve. So anything that changes any of these three variables here will shift the curve. If we have an increase in G, that would increase our deficit, right? Because we're spending more. And so our whole curve is going to shift up that way to get a new line over here. Same thing if we have an increase in the interest rate, right? Because these two are positively related. This one, of course, is negatively related, taxes. If we have an increase in taxes, then we're going to have a reduction in the deficit, so our whole curve would shift down. And notice when we shift our curve down, now this red area is a lot smaller, and our green area expands to all of that, right? So we have more of a chance of getting a surplus with a lower amount of GDP. So that's usually good, although raising taxes isn't good for your stance as a government, really. And then movements along the curve, that's just with GDP. So as your GDP, let's say to start, our GDP is over here. Well, currently we're at a deficit of whatever this is. But if our GDP increases to over here, now we're at a surplus. So in the event of a recession, we'll probably be in a deficit. And in the event of a boom, we'll probably be in a surplus. And the reason for that kind of makes sense, because our taxes go up. The more government collects more money from taxes as GDP goes up, because more people have more money to pay to taxes, which means more money is going to the government. So if the government is getting more money, then T is going up, right? And if T goes up, then we just saw that this curve is going to shift down, down, and it will be easier for us to be in a surplus. So we say that the actual budget deficit is the structural, move over here for a sec, the structural deficit plus the cyclical deficit. So the structural deficit is sometimes called the cyclically adjusted deficit, and it's the deficit if y is equal to y star. Same as previous chapters, there was no cyclical unemployment in the case where y equals y star, same kind of thing. There is no cyclical deficit in that case either. So if we look at this budget deficit function here, at the y star point, this purple distance here is the structural deficit, because that is the difference between the x-axis and the line here, the structural deficit. But if we then see a recession and we see y move to y1, we see a reduction in GDP. Well, now we're farther up this line here, and this distance in between the structural deficit, this purple line, and like this triangle really, this part is known as the cyclical deficit, because this is the additional deficit that we have when y does not equal y star. Okay? So, where's the quiz here? So, going back to this one, it says, initially suppose real GDP is 100 million and the budget deficit is 4 million. So we're at this point A here. How would we move to point B? How are we going to move to point B? Well, point B is a greater amount of real GDP. So when do we have more GDP? When we're entering a boom, when we're entering an inflationary gap. Okay. Actual and structural budget deficits. So these are, you'll notice any years that they're different, that means that there is a cyclical deficit as well. So this is actual and this is structural. Consider the years 2008 to 2010, so these last 3 years. The fact that the actual budget deficit in each year was greater than the structural budget deficit reflects the fact that, so the actual budget deficit was pretty big compared to just the structural one. And let's think about what happened in 2008. We had the massive stock market crash, right? So we entered a recession. What happens in a recession? Well, our GDP goes down. So it would make sense that we would have a cyclical deficit. So what we see here is that actual GDP is less than potential in each of those years. And if you know anything about Canadian history or even worldwide history, that makes sense. Suppose the government's objective is to hold its debt to GDP ratio constant at its current level of 30%. If the real interest rate on government bonds is 4% and the growth rate of real GDP is 2%, the government must. This is another formula. So we'll go down to that formula somewhere. Here we go. So this is the formula here, where D is the debt to GDP ratio, X is the primary budget deficit, which is just G minus T. No, there's no ID. R is the interest rate, or it's sometimes more expanded as the average real interest rate on bonds, or something about that. And that should be of. G is the growth rate of GDP. So in this question, it gives us the ratio. We want the ratio to be held constant. So we want the change in D to be 0. The change in D to be 0. And then it says that the real interest rate on government bonds is 4% and the real growth rate of GDP is 2%. And we want it to maintain its current rate of 30%. So we want to know what, this is X. So we say X plus the rate was 4% and GDP was growing at a rate of 2%. These should be written as percentages. So 0.04 minus 0.02 times 0.3. And then just doing some simple algebra there, you get 0.02 times 0.3 is some really small number, 3/500. So that means X has to equal -3/500, and we are going to get that into a percentage, so we'll multiply it by 100, which gives us -0.6. So what does it mean that this primary, remember X is the primary budget deficit, so if it's negative, that means that we have a budget surplus of 0.6%, or a primary budget deficit of -0.6%. So for this one here, we want to run a primary budget surplus of 0.6% of GDP. Diagram below is for a closed economy. So closed economy means no trade. Suppose the government in this closed economy implements an expansionary fiscal policy, which increases the budget deficit. An expansionary fiscal policy would be to increase G or reduce T, which is going to shift us to AD1, right? It'll increase. When the economy reaches its new long-run equilibrium, how is the composition of national income changed? So we're going to go to AD1, and then without any government intervention, we're going to shift up. AS is going to shift up, and we're going to get to this new equilibrium here at P2 and Y star. So what does that look like, though? What does that look like? So we see an expansionary policy of AD2. It goes to AD2, and that's either by G going up or T going down. And that increases our deficit. When our deficit goes up, we're going to see a decrease in national saving. And that makes sense, right? Because the deficit is like the government's saving. And because national saving is public plus private saving, public being the government, if the public saving is going down, national saving will be going down as well. It's also built up of this equation here. So we see with G, it's pretty obvious that G going up would decrease this because they're negatively related. And T, I think you just have to kind of make sense of it. It would increase the deficit. And we're just saying, even though it's not in the formula directly, that it would decrease national saving. Okay, so move over here a little bit. So this is Q investment over here. It's kind of blocked off. So when we decrease national saving, we move up along this investment demand curve to a higher level of interest rate and a lower level of investment. So at the end of the day, we get back to potential output over here, but our investment is said to be crowded out because now there is this raised interest rate and it's said to be crowded out. So this is a little contrary to previous examples when we've seen like increases or decreases in the money supply, where we've seen that the neutrality of money doesn't affect the interest rate. This actually does affect the interest rate. We're stuck at this higher interest rate. So even though we're at this new higher level of aggregate demand, and it means that our AE curve has shifted up as well, our AE is made up of C plus I plus G plus NX. So this is a closed economy, so there's no NX. And we've said that G has gone up and investment has gone down. So that may have been all that happened. It may have been that consumption has gone up as well. And if it wasn't a closed economy, NX could have gone up as well. So when our investment goes down, in order to make this AE curve go up, the other three variables in some proportion have gone up. And we call that the crowding out of investment, because we still see an increase in the price level, right? This is the price level, but investment has been crowded out. So investment has fallen. It can be argued that a government budget deficit, rather than being a burden for future generations, may provide net benefits to future generations. This view is correct if the current budget deficit is used to finance projects that deliver long-term benefits to society. That kind of makes sense. I went over it briefly here. So our budget deficit's bad. They're not necessarily bad if the increased deficit is going to give us benefits to future generations, because maybe they're increasing spending now, but it's going to have long-term benefits in the future. That may be a good thing. But if it just benefits the current generation, it's probably not a good thing. But that is the one case where it could be. I think we're going to see a lot of these questions on the exam, just because it's kind of the only thing that you can talk about related to this topic, like this chapter, in a David Johnson-esque way. So what has the government done? I actually got one in the mail the other day. It's like they're giving us all checks, a large increase in transfers. That's what the government's been doing. That's how they've been combating it. If the government had a balanced budget rule at the federal level, the rule would be least stabilizing if it applied over. So the textbook goes through a couple of balanced budget rules. There, perfect. So the two that it talks about are annually balanced budgets and cyclically balanced budgets. So an annually balanced budget would be a budget that is balanced every year. And then it talks about how that's not really realistic because a significant portion of the budget is beyond the short-term control, short-term being 1 year, and a further large chunk is hard to change quickly. That's should be spending. Many spending programs also, like pensions, may be set in legislation, and they may be hard to change, especially on a year-by-year basis. And even if it were possible, it would be undesirable because we know that tax revenues rise in booms and fall in recessions, right? There's that automatic stabilizer there that is slowing down the booms or slowing down the recessions. Well, if we have to balance it every year, then it's no longer slowing them down. It's just balancing. So it would remove those automatic stabilizers, and we would see increased swings in real GDP, which isn't really a good thing. And then the other one it talks about is cyclically balanced budgets. So that's balancing a budget over the course of a business cycle. So if we're in a inflationary gap, then we should have a surplus, and if we're in a recessionary gap, we should have a deficit. So in theory, this is a really good idea. The problem is it's hard to measure. It's a theoretical thing. It's not easy to measure that. So it kind of leaves it up to politicians. Politicians can be like, oh no, we're definitely having an inflationary gap this year, so I'm going to spend lots of money. Like it's because it's such a theoretical concept, it can't really be put into legislation. You can't set that out as a law. So it's more of like a guideline as opposed to legislation. And so over the business cycle is said to be the least stabilizing because it leaves all that control to politicians. A couple more notes. What else did I have here? We went through this. Yep. Structural deficit, debt to GDP ratio we did. Crowding out of investment. That's pretty much all of it. So I'll do one more quiz. Chapter 31. Start test. A little stretch there, but that's fine. That's all fitting. Sample equation describing the government budget constraint is. So that is their expenditure is equal to their tax revenue plus their borrowing. We kind of went through that already. It's not too tricky of a concept to understand, so I won't dwell on that. Suppose the stock of government debt at the end of fiscal year 1 is 475 billion. If the stock of debt falls to 461 billion, then we know that during year 2, well, look, their debt has fallen, right? It was originally this, and now they're only owing that. So that means that we had an annual budget surplus of $14 billion. Not a primary, it was an annual, because stock of debt includes the interest payments that we owe, right? So it means it's an annual, not a primary. We're including interest payments. And we know it's a surplus, not a deficit, because it's gone down. Consider two economies, A and B. A has a government debt equal to 800 billion and B is 22 billion. In order to determine the economic importance of these government debts, it is necessary to know the GDP, because we want to know the debt to GDP ratio. That's what the point of this question is. It's asking, we want to know how big these debts, how big they are relative to the economy. So we need the GDP to be able to do that. Consider the government's budget to deficit function, other things being equal, an autonomous increase in government purchases causes. So, an autonomous increase in government purchases. An increase in G will shift the curve up, quite simply. So it will be an upward shift of the budget deficit function. Consider a government with a positive stock of debt. If the growth rate of real GDP exceeds the real rate of interest on government bonds, then to keep the debt to GDP ratio constant, the growth rate of GDP exceeds the real interest rate. So where's our formula? Here it is. So G is bigger than R. So if our formula is X plus R minus G times D, and this portion is going to be negative because G is bigger than R, so when you do R minus G, you're going to get a negative number, times D, you'll still get a negative number. So to keep the debt to GDP ratio constant, so we want this change in D, let's just scribble that out, we want this to equal 0. So what does this have to be? Well, this has to be positive. So the government must have a primary budget deficit, which is kind of weird. I don't know why you'd want that. Usually you'd want to lower your debt to GDP ratio, but that's fine. Consider an open economy. An expansionary fiscal policy will generally increase the government's budget deficit. It's going to increase their deficit. What we also know, and isn't as apparent, is it's going to actually appreciate the currency. It's going to make our currency more valuable. I'm not totally sure why, if I'm being honest. But if you're just reading these, so surplus and surplus is out. That leaves deficit, deficit, and deficit. And then we know that if we have an appreciation of our currency, then we're going to see net exports go down, right? If our money is more valuable, our prices are going to be higher, then net exports will go down. And if we have a depreciation of our currency, then our net exports will go up. So we need to have an opposite there, right? So we have appreciation and increase, that's not opposite. Depreciation and decrease, that's not opposite either. So this is the only one that actually makes sense. And that's how I kind of logicked this question out. I'm not totally sure how it actually appreciates the currency. If anyone knows, let me know. Until the onset of the most recent recession in 2009, Canadian governments, federal and provincial, had been running budget surpluses for about 10 years. Economic theory suggests that, other things being equal, these surpluses will lead to. So we just said that, what did we say here? We said an increase in the deficit will appreciate the currency. So that means if we had a decrease in the deficit, then we're going to depreciate the currency. So it would lead to a depreciation of the currency. But that's not what we want here, because it wouldn't, net exports wouldn't fall. And this is the opposite of what we wanted. I'm pretty sure this is the answer. So it would be, we know that national saving is going to rise because we're having surpluses. So that leaves D and E. And what happens when national saving rises? When national saving rises, investment demand, that's I. This is quantity. We're going to see an increase of investment. So that would be a crowding in of investment. We're getting more investment. Instead of crowding it out this time, we're going to crowd it in. And we're also going to crowd in investments in net exports as well. I'm not really sure why that is, but this part of it makes sense, and so that part makes it the right answer. It can be argued that a government budget deficit, rather than being a burden, may provide benefits. We talked about that, and that's if it finances long-term benefits to society. The fiscal response, a large increase in transfers. Over the business cycle, we did that too. Hopefully that's 10 out of 10. Perfect. Alright, that's the end of this video in chapter 31.